Good morning, everyone. Nice to see, it's very loud, William. Nice to see you all again. Glad that you could make it. This our second live meeting. Just a couple of things I'd like to say first, because I may forget to say them later, so I'll say it now. Firstly, the Christmas lunch is on the 9th of December at the Royal Court, and we hope we'll have lots of people there so we can have really good time. And secondly, one of our groups, the Creative Writing Group, Mary from the Creative Writing, she's actually the group leader, has written a book, and we're having a book launch on the 21st of November at the Royal Court, bubbly at 2:30 and 3 till 4, various speakers and Mary talking from her book. So if you could attend and let us know, that would be lovely. We would really like that. So now I'm going to pass you over to our Honourable Secretary, Alan, and he's going to introduce our speaker this morning. Thank you. Are you coming up the steps, Alan?
Hello. Okay. Yeah. Good. You can hear okay? Splendid. Okay. What do you want, the phone? I'll fix it. Yes. Tanya is waving her phone about and tells me that would you please switch your phone off? Jeremy would normally have been saying that because his voice used to come down through the Riverside Theatre saying, "Ladies and gentlemen, before this evening performance starts, will you please switch off your telephone?" But it's with mixed feelings that I'm introducing Jeremy today, because this is the second time, at least, that I'm deeply in his debt. So I'm not quite sure what the damage will be from today, having got him to come at very short notice. But Jeremy is an old colleague and an old friend of mine from the days of the Riverside Theatre, which I inherited when I became the provost of Coleraine University way back. One of my duties was to look after the Riverside Theatre. And it was very much with a sense of deja vu that I read last week's Chronicle headlines, which said that the funding for the Riverside was in danger again, because 2 weeks after I started working as provost, the Arts Council for Northern Ireland unilaterally withdrew all the funding from provincial theatres and placed it in all their money in Belfast, which didn't go down very well. Fortunately, in those days, the Coleraine Borough Council was enormously supportive, and Eddie Andrew and his key team moved in, and we were able to salvage the Riverside Theatre funding by simply dividing it between the Borough Council and the university. So we kept the Riverside going. Simultaneously with all that happening, the university went through one of its periodic phases of throwing the Lego box in the air and trying to reassemble it in different formats. You're normally requiring more expensive pieces, which then got lost later on. And what had happened was the management of the theatre was changed several times. It wasn't really working very well, and we were in desperate straits. And Jeremy had been managing the theatre remarkably well for a long time. Then the university threw the Lego box in the air. Jeremy wasn't managing the theatre, and we were in trouble. And I went to him and I said, "Jeremy, would you manage the theatre again?" And I thought he would reply with that famous sentence reply when Mike Harding mentioned to the Beatles that they'd look better if they wore suits. And he said they replied with a short sentence connected with sex and travel. And I expected Jeremy would say the same thing to me, but he didn't. He was very kindly agreed to take on the theatre again. And he did a remarkable job of keeping the theatre going over those years. So very well done to that. And then the second debt, which now I owe him, of course, is that Steve Aitken very sadly couldn't come. He's involved with the climate conference in Glasgow, so he couldn't come today. And I rang Jeremy last week and said, "We're in deep trouble, can you come?" And immediately, of course, he said yes. So I'm very much in his debt, particularly since his mum's had a nasty fall and she's in hospital. So it's very, very good of Jeremy to be here today. And it's my great pleasure to welcome him to speak to you today on theatrical disasters.
Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. It's lovely to be here, and thank you, Alan, for that very kind introduction. I very rarely get asked to come out and speak to people. And in the next 40 or so minutes, you'll find out why. But it is lovely, as I'm sure everybody would agree, that after 18 months of house arrest, we're getting back to a semblance of normality again. Now, while I've called this talk Theatrical Disasters, you'll see fairly quickly that what I'm referring to is not so much the physical aspects of what constitutes a calamity in theatre. For example, stage sets collapsing in the middle of a show, or curtains bursting into flames, or dressing rooms flooded with a foot of water. Though I have to tell you, I did see all of those things happen in the 25 years or so that I worked in the Riverside. The flooded dressing room, to give you one example, was during the big freeze, I think, which was in 2010. And the height of the snowy weather. You'll remember the dreadful roads in Coleraine that were almost impassable. You couldn't get your car out. And like many people in Coleraine, my water had been turned off for 3 days, no mains water whatsoever. And I thought, well, I'm going to have to get a shower some way. So I trudged from my flat on the Castle Rock Road onto the university campus, let myself into the back door of the Riverside, and was greeted by a cascade of water coming down the stairs from the dressing rooms. All the pipes in the lower end of the theatre had burst, and the place was absolutely full of water. So I still didn't get a shower for a further 3 days. Now, the burning curtains also happened very soon after Riverside first opened in 1976, because, as I'm sure you'll all know, there was no such thing really in those days as health and safety. And there were no really annual inspections as such of technical equipment in theatres in the way that there are nowadays. All the visits from the fire prevention officer, I think it used to happen about once every 5 years, something like that. But I do remember during a student production of Shakespeare's Macbeth, they had a little real fire underneath the witch's cauldron. And unfortunately, the real fire set light to one of the curtains at the side of the stage. And with marvelous, thought, improvisation, if you will, the actor playing Macduff raced off the stage into the wings, came back on in full costume with a fire extinguisher and put it out. But if memory serves me correctly, one of Riverside's most celebrated technical disasters took place in the late 70s during Portrush Music Society's Christmas concert. There were 5 rows of tiered seats on the stage for the singers, about 80 singers altogether. This was a big production in those days. In the middle of the concert, for some unknown reason, the top tier collapsed. About 15 singers went flying over all the other ones in front. How nobody was hurt, we still don't realize to this day. I think it was just, a couple of bruised elbows and things, but luckily no broken bones. But it looked quite a spectacle if you'd been there to see it. Now, those are examples. Those 2 examples I've given you are little illustrations of physical disasters. But this morning, I'd really prefer to talk to you about theatre people, because theatre people have been called a very peculiar variety of the human race. Unique, in fact. People of the theatre, and that includes writers, directors, actors, technicians, even humble administrators, they are capable of producing a higher caliber of disaster, better than any physical calamity that even an act of God could come up with, particularly by saying the wrong thing at the wrong time. But I do think it's true when people say that theatre folk exist in a state which is only occasionally recognizable to the rest of the world. Okay, it's a profession which can look on the surface attractively glamorous, even exciting. But it's also a profession in which envy, jealousy, and malice tend to rear their heads frequently. For example, I remember once speaking to an agent on the phone speaking about the possibility of trying to get hold of a particular actor from Belfast to do a show. And I asked about this man's availability, and the agent said, "Oh yes, yes." He said, "I saw him a couple of weeks ago. He was walking down Lover's Lane in Hollywood and holding his own hand." And I can also vividly remember when in the early 80s, Riverside produced Peter Pan as its Christmas show. Now, this was a memorable production in many ways and included a still at Coleraine Inst schoolboy, James Nesbitt Jr., as one of the lost boys. Now, the actor in this production of Peter Pan playing Captain Hook, who is still alive and who shall remain nameless, had something of a drink problem. And the problem basically was that he couldn't get enough of it. As a result, he had a tendency during shows to mangle his lines. During the final dress rehearsal, I remember watching spellbound from the back of the auditorium, because you'll remember, those of you who know Peter Pan, there is a section at the very end of the play where Tinkerbell has died. And Peter has to come forward and plead, particularly to the young children in the audience, to help bring Tinkerbell back to life. And Peter Pan looks at the children in the audience and he says, "Children, do you believe in fairies?" And at that point, from the back of the auditorium, Roma Tumulty, daughter of the playwright Joe Tumulty and sister of the actress Frances, who was Riverside's much feared administrator of that time, she boomed out at the top of her voice, "Believe in them? Darling, I've worked with hundreds of them over the last 10 years. So regrettably, if you think about it, alcohol has been, over the years, the downfall of many a star of stage and screen, even when you believe they're possibly at their most successful. You remember from only a couple of years ago, one of television's most popular duos, Ant and Dec, were thrown into complete disarray when one of them, I think, had to go into rehab for 6 months. And this is something which has been part of the theatre and the entertainment industry for so long. And I suspect it's something to do with the fact that, you know, once you get to the top in theatre or in the arts in general, there's only one way you can go, and that's down again, unless you're lucky enough to, you know, retain that position of excellence. In 1930, for example, the distinguished English actors Wilfrid Lawson and Robert Newton, both seasoned drinkers, were playing at a production of Richard III in London. One Wednesday, just before the 2:30 p.m. matinee performance of the play, the two of them had been downing pints of beer in a Covent Garden pub. They made it to the theatre just in time for the opening. Lawson stumbled onto the stage as the king, and before he was very far into the opening soliloquy, "Now is the winter of our discontent," there was a shout from the back of the auditorium. "You're drunk!" He tried it again. "Now is the winter of our discontent. You're drunk!" So Wilfrid Lawson went right to the front of the stage and addressed the audience directly. "If you think I'm drunk, sir, just wait until you see the Duke of Buckingham." It's this, I suppose, kind of behavior which has to a degree tainted the acting profession to some small degree. When the movie star Victor Mature applied for membership of a smart Californian golf club, his application was turned down on the grounds that actors were not allowed to be members. He wrote back immediately to the club's secretary, "But I am not an actor," he said, "and I have a scrapbook full of reviews to prove it." Talking of Roma Tumulty just a minute or so ago has reminded me of a lovely story about Roma. Roma was my boss in Riverside for 2 years. She was a distinguished actress herself. She wrote children's books, but she was quite acerbic in her dealings with people, and could be quite peremptory, and was certainly somebody who didn't in any way suffer fools gladly. And I can remember in 1980, as I'm sure you can, the Opera House in Belfast was reopened after having lay derelict for something like about 7 years. During the height of the Troubles at that point, the theatre had been shut. And in 1980, the administrator of the time, who was a man called Michael Barnes, and Michael lectured, I think, in history at Queen's, as well as being the administrator of the Opera House. Michael had planned this very, very elaborate celebration of the arts in Northern Ireland and Northern Ireland's contribution to the arts. And as a result, there was this star-studded evening in the Opera House with actors like Dennis Hawthorne and Colin Blakely, and there were poets. Seamus Heaney came on stage and read. There were dancers. There was the singer Ewell Dean. And I was very lucky to be invited down to the opening, the grand opening that night, with Roma as my boss. And we went into the theatre. We sat and watched the first half of the show with huge enjoyment. And as the lights came up for the interval, we were heading out towards the bar for, I think, a cup of coffee. And Roma trod very heavily on some poor lady's feet as we were getting out of the row. And you could see the lady, you know, in huge discomfort. So Roma didn't say a word. She just wandered out and I followed her. So when we came back in after the interval had finished and the house lights had actually gone down, so we were struggling to find our seats in the darkness, I could see Roma talking to a lady in the row. And I could hear Roma say, "Excuse me," she said, "did I tread on your foot earlier on as we were going out to the interval?" And the lady said, "Yes, yes, you did." And Roma said to me, "Come along, Jeremy, this is our row." Now, the actress Vivien Leigh, who was once married to the great Laurence Olivier, also had something of an acerbic wit. And she also associated with all the literati, particularly in America, where she spent a lot of her career. And Vivien Leigh was one day walking through Times Square with the great American playwright, Tennessee Williams. But as they were walking through Times Square, they both spotted a lady on the other side of the road who was frighteningly thin, very, very thin indeed. And Tennessee Williams said to Vivien Leigh, "My goodness, Vivien, she's so skeletal." "Oh, Tennessee," said Vivien, that's anorexia nervosa." "Oh, Vivien," said Tennessee Williams, "you know just everybody in New York." Now, the London impresario Cameron Mackintosh has told the story of the lavish opening night reception for his hugely successful musical Les Miserables. The champagne was flowing like river, but still not fast enough for legendary drinker comedian Peter Cook. He was one of the invited guests that night. And ingeniously, as every time a waiter would pass by, Peter Cook would grab a bottle of champagne off the tray and say to the waiter, "Excuse me, but Melvin Bragg's over there causing a bit of a disturbance. I think this bottle will pacify him." Now, apart from the demon drink, one of the biggest causes of theatrical or performance-related disaster is connected to the concept of communication. Communication itself has been responsible for many a mishap in performance with actors, musicians, dancers, you name it, it's happened. Now, I do recall an incident closer to home going back over 30 years ago in the days when I was the university's arts administrator. And with a great degree of financial help from the Arts Council of Northern Ireland, I booked a quite distinguished Russian pianist called Nikolai Demidenko. And Demidenko was scheduled to come to the Great Hall in Magee, in the Magee campus, to perform on the university's newly acquired baby grand piano. He was going to be the first person to play this piano. And Mr. Demidenko did have, unfortunately, a very limited command of English. Equally, my Russian, apart from hello, goodbye, and thank you, was entirely non-existent. So from the moment he arrived, there was always going to be a degree of communication problem between us. So Mr. Demidenko arrived on the campus at 3 o'clock that afternoon and went straight to the Great Hall for scheduled 2 hours of practice. Now, he'd hardly sat down to begin when one of the campus cleaning ladies charged into the room with an electric floor polisher. Now, ignoring the pianist, who was still tinkling away, she switched it on and proceeded to burnish the floor with enormous gusto. Now, I could see from a distance Mr. Demidenko throwing up his hands in horror, and all we could hear in Russian was probably the equivalent of, "This is terrible, terrible." So he stopped playing, stood up, made his way quickly to the back of the Great Hall, went through a little swing door, which led, unknown to him, into a cleaner's cupboard. And he stayed in the cleaner's cupboard waiting for the floor to be finished. In the meantime, a security man had come into the Great Hall and informed the cleaning lady that she was wanted by her supervisor downstairs. So the burnisher was switched off, the cleaning lady went out, and the security man, not realizing that Mr. Demidenko was at the back of the hall, went to the cleaner's cupboard, locked it, went to the Great Hall, locked the door, and went downstairs with the cleaner. Well, by this point, I had gone to the Vice Chancellor's office because I was checking over an invitation list for a function which was going to be held at the end of the recital that night. So we didn't know any of this was going on. By the time it got to about 6 o'clock, it suddenly occurred to us, none of us had seen Mr. Demidenko for about 2 hours. So we went back into the Great Hall, and all we could hear was coming from the rear of the hall. The security man undid the door, and there was Mr. Demidenko in his shirt, covered in perspiration coming. And he was in the most fearful state. Luckily, he got onto stage that night and performed magnificently. I mean, nobody would have known anything was wrong, but he must have gone back to Russia and said, "Do you know, on my first visit to Ireland, they locked me in a cupboard." So again, part of the whole problem of communication. Now, as I said to you earlier, in the strictest definition of the terminology, that anecdote I've just given you wasn't quite a theatrical disaster, but still, I think you get the idea of the territory in which I ventured. It's people, performing people, who are often quite the most reliable in terms of producing either an interesting story or some kind of a disaster. The actor and comedian and recently Black Lives activist Lenny Henry was, he was saying on television, I remember some months ago, recalling an occasion where he had brought over to London for his own theatre company, very distinguished actress from the Black Harlem Theatre Company. And she'd never been out of America before, and she was coming to London for the very first time. And they were traveling back from Heathrow Airport into the center of London. And this actress was terribly interested in all the kind of trees, particularly, that they were passing on the journey. So she said at one point to Lenny Henry, "What are those trees, Lenny?" And he said, "Oh, well, they're cherry blossom trees." "Oh, and what are those pink flowers over there?" "Well, they're rhododendrons." "Oh, and what are those little white things?" "Oh, those are English people." Now, you also might remember that when the actors Vincent Price and Coral Brown got married in 1974, the couple was each considerably past their 70 years and 10. Following the honeymoon, very elaborate ceremony held in London, they went a couple of weeks later, having purchased a lovely flat in Pimlico, they went to Harrods, the great department store, to order a bed. A very posh sales assistant in Harrods was quite apologetic. Oh, I'm terribly sorry, Mr. and Mrs. Price. It will take 3 months for this bed to arrive. Coral Brown exploded. 3 months? 3 months, she says, darling, look at us. Do you think we've got that long? But the actor of the last 50 years, who probably holds the record for dropping the greatest number of verbal clangers, and who featured in the greatest number of what can be termed theatrical disasters, is the late Sir John Gale. In his very long career, Sir John was acting well into his 90s. He worked with every major screen and television actor in the English language. He also worked with international actors on the London and New York stage. Now, he worked on a number of occasions, for example, with Ingrid Bergman, but the two of them never really got on. And Gielgud said to an interviewer on the BBC at one point, when asked what it was like having worked with Ingrid Bergman, he said, oh, poor Ingrid, he said. She speaks 5 languages fluently, can't act in any one of them. On another occasion in London, on a first night, Sir John Gielgud electrified the audience by suddenly stepping out of character in mid-scene and moving to the very front of the stage. And he looked at the audience in front of him. Is there a doctor in the house? There was a little pause, and somebody stood up in the dress circle. And Gielgud looked at him. Ah, doctor, he said, isn't this a terrible play? He then turned around and just carried back on as if nothing had happened. Now, devotees of television's Last of the Summer Wine will know of the actor Peter Sallis. Peter Sallis was also the voice. He played Clegg in Last of the Summer Wine. And he was also one of the 2 voices in Wallace and Gromit, the Wallace and Gromit movies. Sallis auditioned for John Gielgud on one occasion when Gielgud was directing Richard II at the National Theatre. And Gielgud said during the course of the interview to Peter Sallis, well, what part ideally would you like to play in this? And Sallis responded by saying, well, I'd like to play the gardener. It's a lovely part. Oh, that's already cast, I'm afraid, said Gielgud. Then Gielgud's eyes shone triumphantly. I said, I've got it. You could play Green. He said, the 2 men playing Bushy and Bagot are very distinguished and very handsome. You might make an excellent contrast to them. On another occasion, Gielgud entertained playwright John Mortimer, famous for Rumpole of the Bailey, and his wife to dinner. And the 2 of them arrived at John Gielgud's house, and they brought with them their fortnight-old baby with them in a carry cot. And Gielgud took a look at the carry cot, had a look at the baby, and he said, what on earth did you bring that with you for? He said, are you frightened of burglars? Now, unfortunately, the theatre world is strewn with a large cast of characters, actors, musicians, who were as well known for their disasters in the profession as for their actual successes. And of course, one of the most influential of all of these over the last 30 years, if you think particularly of the Carry On movies, was the comedian and actor Kenneth Williams. Now, Kenneth Williams was unlike me, a master raconteur, and he performed all of his anecdotes, particularly on television, with the aid of pursed lips, flaring nostrils, and he had a very strange voice, which kind of changed gear every 10 minutes or so. And one of the biggest theatrical disasters that Kenneth Williams was ever involved in as an actor was in a play in the mid-1960s called Gentle Jack. Now, Gentle Jack was written by the playwright Robert Bolt, and you'll know Robert Bolt, I'm sure. He's probably most well known for the play A Man for All Seasons, which was filmed memorably with Robert Shaw. So this production of Gentle Jack, Williams was playing the lead, and the female lead was being played by one of the most distinguished actresses of the 20th century, Dame Edith Evans. Of course, you remember Dame Edith Evans from her sterling performance in the movie of The Importance of Being Earnest. She's the maid that has to say, "A handbag," you know, that marvelous quavering voice that she had. And in fact, when Dame Edith was told that Kenneth Williams was going to be cast in the lead of Gentle Jack, she said to her agent, "Well, why have they chosen Kenneth Williams? He's got such a peculiar voice." But anyway, the two of them got on extremely well. But unfortunately, the play was a complete disaster. Audiences, for whatever reason, hated it. There was terrible booing and shouting. And in the 1960s, audiences were an awful lot less well behaved than they are now. I mean, you would very rarely think of going to a theater and shouting out boo, you know, if you didn't like what was being done on the stage. You'd simply leave at the interval, or you'd tell all your friends about the production afterwards and they wouldn't go and see it. But of course, in the mid-1960s, people didn't think twice about shouting out boo if they hated, you know, the show that was on stage. So Dame Edith and Williams came off stage after the first night, and Dame Edith said to Kenneth Williams, she said, "Well, I thought I heard one bravo." And Kenneth Williams said, no, that was "go home." So they got to the hotel where they were staying. And of course, the tradition in those days, in the 1960s, was the same as it is nowadays. Productions are tried out in the south of England, particularly in the seaside cities and towns, before they end up with a run in London's West End. So the two of them were staying in this little seaside town, about 10 miles away from the theatre. And they got back, of course, at about 11:15 at night. And they hadn't eaten. I mean, actors never eat before a show. That can lead to disasters of all kinds. So they went to the dining room, and of course, they were the only two people in the hotel dining room. And they were being looked after by a very elderly man who was actually the night porter, and he was also doubling up as the waiter. And on this very, very quiet dining room, there were two plates with a chicken and ham salad and two tin plates covering the top of them. So Williams and Dame Edith sat down and started eating this very dispiriting meal with nobody else in the dining room at all, you know, the place entirely deserted. So the head waiter said to Edith, "Your partner in crime's had her grub." Now, what he was referring to, the partner in crime, was actually Dame Edith Evans's spiritual advisor. Dame Edith Evans' spiritual advisor traveled with her everywhere she went. She was a deeply religious woman. She didn't believe in medicines or drugs of any kind. She believed that the power of prayer would be quite sufficient, you know, to cope with any adversity. So the head waiter looked at the two of them and he said, slightly conspiratorially, he said, "Would you fancy a drop of wine?" So Dame Edith said, "Well, a half bottle of Beaujolais wouldn't go amiss." "Right," he says, "I've got the very thing for you." So he went to this corner cabinet in the room and took out a half bottle of Beaujolais. And as he was bending over, he most unfortunately broke wind with the most alarming ferocity. But it really rang out in the confines of the empty room. And Dame Edith Evans just looked at Kenneth Williams and she said, "Kenneth, this place has gone off terribly." Now, I think you'll agree that it is a combination of dottiness and vulnerability which makes many creative people, such as actors and directors, so endearing. The very famous British married acting couple, Michael Denison and Dulcie Gray, were reputedly among the dottiest of them all. And they spent a large part of the 40s and 50s starring very successfully in a whole range of London West End plays and also British movies of the time. And on one particular occasion, when the two of them were performing in a drawing room comedy in the West End of London, the production was going beautifully until, unfortunately, one of them died, and there was a terrible silence, terrible gap of silence. About 5 minutes on stage is an eternity when nobody's saying anything. So the prompter, concealed in the wings, hissed out the missing line. There was still a terrible silence, nothing said at all. So the prompter hissed the line out again. At that point, Dulcie Gray turned her face towards the wings and she says, "Darling, we know the line, but which of us says it?" There's also a very nice story told of the very first time that the Royal Ballet Company visited Australia. I think it was the late 40s, early 50s. And the company was run at that time by Robert Helpman, who I think, apart from being a dancer, was one of the main choreographers of the company. And because there were something like 80, 85 dancers, there was no theatre big enough in Melbourne to actually put this production of A Midsummer Night's Dream, the ballet, which had been choreographed by Helpman. There was no venue large enough in the city to put it on. So the company negotiated with the city council, and they were allocated one of the main cricket grounds in Melbourne. And a huge stage was built in the middle of this cricket area, and all these expensive lights were brought in, and sets and scenery. So it was going to be quite a marvelous thing. And it was, of course, going to be an outdoor production, but lit at night with a full symphony orchestra in the stadium as well. And of course, because it was a cricket pavilion, there were no such things as proper dressing rooms. So Robert Helpman, being the main character of the company, was given what was considered to be the best room. And this was a room that was used by the umpires. So Robert Helpman had to use an umpire's room for dressing in and getting ready for the actual production, doing his makeup. So when it got to the half is 25 minutes before a show begins. And generally speaking, what you have is somebody knocks on your dressing room door and says, "Excuse me, 25 minutes to go. This is your first call for beginners." So somebody knocked on the door of the umpire's room and they didn't get the answer. So they walked into the room and there was Robert Helpman standing on a chair on the table underneath a bare light bulb that hung from the ceiling. And he was holding a hand mirror in one hand and some very elaborate makeup in the other, doing this green and gold makeup for the part of Oberon that he was going to play in the ballet later on. So the person who wandered into the room said, "Are you all right?" And Robert Helpman said, "Oh, I'm all right, but God knows how these umpires manage." Now, Peter Brooke, who made his name in British theatre during the 50s and 60s, is one of the most famous directors, and who was still working like John Gale good into his late 80s, is another good example of a creative person who lives in a slightly more removed and ethereal world than the rest of us. On one occasion, Brooke was having a few drinks in a London pub and he spotted an actor that he thought he knew. So he went over to chat to him, even though he couldn't remember the actor's name. "You were very good at the National," said Brooke. "Oh, I'm sorry, Mr. Brooke," said the young actor, "but I've never actually worked at the National." "I know I've seen you somewhere," said Brooke. "Was it the RSC?" No, Mr. Brooke, I've never been with the RSC either." "Look," he said, "I know I've seen you somewhere. Where have you been working recently?" The young actor looked slightly embarrassed. "To tell you the truth, Mr. Brooke, I haven't had an acting job in 2 years. I've been working on the bacon counter in the food hall at Harrods. Ah, said Brooke, that's where I saw you. You were slicing marvelously. Now, Peter Brooke was long known as an avant-garde director, and there are many like him who terrify actors with the seemingly impossible demands that are made of them during rehearsals. Everything from improvisation through to the more extraordinary psychological exercises where actors are encouraged to believe that, you know, they're on the psychiatrist's couch and they have to pretend to be a tree or a rolling ball. And of course, every actor differs in his or her technique on how they learn lines and how they assimilate methodology of the profession. And when that grand old actress, Dame Irene Handel, was asked in a radio interview in her 93rd year what her method of acting was, she replied, well, I just have a bash at it. And if that doesn't work out, I have another bash at it. And that philosophy seems to me quite sensible. It tends to be the American actors more than anybody else who talk about the method school. You know, the actors who, if they have to play the part of a tramp, say in Waiting for Godot, go and live on the street in New York for a week, you know, to try and prepare themselves for the role. A lot of it is just, you know, tautology. Now, I'd like to bring this little talk to a conclusion with two anecdotes which are slightly closer to home because they have an Irish connection. And for the first of these, I'm sure you remember Eamon Andrews, the ultra-conservative and old-fashioned broadcaster who for years ran radio programs and television programs in Ireland and England, TV panel shows. And of course, Andrews was the first face of This Is Your Life, you know, on British TV. Now, Andrews was a scrupulously polite performer, and he still to this day has a firm reputation as a man who would do anything in his power to avoid controversy or anything untoward. And so when the Irish Times ran a profile of Eamon Andrews in the 70s, the journalist writing the article found that his profile on Eamon Andrews needed a light touch of humor. And he was very short of amusing stories about Eamon Andrews. So he phoned Eamon Andrews' agent. And he said to the agent, do you think you could give me a nice anecdote about Eamon? And there was a pause. Oh, said the agent, I don't think Eamon would want to be involved in anything as risque as an anecdote. And that was it. So This Is Your Life was obviously the TV program most dreamt about by appearing on, you know, by actors of the time. It was a great way, particularly if you've been in the profession for 20, 30, 40 years of spotlighting and showing your achievements over a period of time. When Robert Morley, the actor Robert Morley, went on This Is Your Life, he went for a drink afterwards with Rex Harrison, who had been one of the guests who had come on celebrating Robert Morley's life. And Rex Harrison protested, and he said to Robert Morley, he said, oh no, he said, you know, I could never have appeared on a program like This Is Your Life, you know, not with my 6 marriages, my 5 divorces, all the troubles in my life. But then, of course, Robert, he said, very different for you. He said, your life has been so completely contrasting. 1 wife, 1 home, and if I may say so, 1 performance. Now, my second and final recollection is probably about the greatest Irish actor of the 20th century, Michael Mcclearmore. Now, Mcclearmore founded and ran for many years the famous Gate Theatre in Dublin. And he ran it with his lifetime partner, Hilton Edwards. And Hilton Edwards was the man who ran the other theatre in London, other theatre in Dublin for a while, the Abbey. Now, as a couple, who never, you know, during the 40s, 50s, and 60s tried to conceal their relationship. They were both held, nevertheless, in great affection by most of the Irish nation. And there were great tributes to Mcclearmore, both on television and film, and similarly to Hilton Edwards after the two of them died. But there was one occasion, I think it was in the early 60s, when Mcclearmore was walking down St. Stephen's Green in Dublin, and he was stopped by a reporter from the Irish Times who was looking for a little bit of, you know, salacious gossip so that he could try and cover some kind of story about Mcclearmore that none of the other papers had tried. So this reporter said to Mcclearmore, he said, tell me this, Michael. He said, when are you and Hilton Edwards going to get married? So Mcclearmore looked at him and said, oh, my dear boy, he said, Hilton and I could never get married. He's a Protestant. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much. That was lovely. And thank you so much for turning up for us. Listening to Jeremy puts me in mind of my theatrical career. Oh, I've just looked at my beloved's face and he's gone quite a pale shade. So I think I'll save that for dinner or at the bar. But thank you very much for coming. It's been really nice to see you all. And we won't see you here again now until January. And we're still working on the speaker for that, but we hope we get someone really good for you. So thanks for coming, everyone.